record it because then it'll get rid of that. So I'm wetting my brush and I'm going into my water and I'm going to give it a really good work in. Really good work in, not tons of water because I don't want it to be like a puddle. I just want enough water to be able to start to dissolve this paint so that when I'm going to use this area of my palette because this has already got blue in it. When I then scrape off that paint into my palette, I want to see that it's the consistency of single cream, okay? So not very, very watery, not so thin that it just looks like blue water. I want it to be the consistency of single cream. So if it's looking a bit thin, if you think, oh God, that's really watery, then go back and just swirl around a little bit more just to dissolve a little bit more paint and bring that over here like that. If you're using tube paints, what you will do is use your dry brush to just pick up a little spot of your blue paint, put it into a new section of your palette, and then add a tiny touch of water on your brush and introduce it into that paint. So we're trying to get the consistency, like I say, of single cream. So when I run my brush through that paint, you can see it's moving around, but it feels fairly thick. It doesn't feel watery. We often describe paints when we're preparing them in our palette using consistencies like tea, so think of like quite watery like tea, or like single cream, which has got that slight more thickness to it. But it's really about starting to recognise those consistencies. And if I was to paint that now, you don't need to do this, but if I was to paint this now onto a piece of paper, that colour is quite rich and strong, okay? So it's not very thin and watery. So I'm happy that I've got a nice mixture of blue there ready to use. I'm going to wash my brush. Now that you may find that you need to change your water quite often today because as your water gets dirty, it may impact your other colours that you're using. Some people like to use 2 water pots on the go, so one to clean their brush and one to dip into that's just got clean water in it. Or you can just refresh your water a little bit more often. So I've washed my brush, I've wiped off a lot of the excess water. I'm going to go now and find a red, and I'm going to do the exact same thing again. So I'm going to pick up a little bit of water, get that in there, really start to get a nice brush full of this red, and then find a spot on my palette. I'm going to use this area because I've already used some red here, and I'm going to wipe that paint into that area and just look at the consistency of it. Now that's already quite thick, so I'm quite happy with that. I'm just going to get a little bit more in there. I'm just scraping that off. So I'm trying to be aware at all times of how much water is on my brush, especially after I've washed it. After I've washed my brush, it's really easy to sort of accidentally go and put that brush straight into some paint. And what you're doing there is you're adding a whole load of water to your paint, which at the moment we don't really want to do. I always get into the habit of just wiping the excess off my brush after I've washed it, so that it's just damp and not full of water. So I've got some blue, got some red. I'm now just going to do the same and get some yellow. I need to change my water already. It's absolutely purple. What I'll do is I'll fill up one of these jugs with clean water, so you can just come and put the dirty water into one, and you can fill up from the other one. are you going to do it? Oh, thank you. Not at this moment, no. I'm just getting some blue, some red and some yellow just prepared in my palette. You'll be fine. I would maybe get a little bit more there because there's not much. So we're going to...
I squashed that out, I think.
We're going to be painting a whole section of that red, and then we're going to be mixing some red and some yellow together. So maybe put a bit more in reserve there. Right. Now I'm not going to rush ahead. I'm going to make sure everybody is happy with the mixtures of paint that they've got. Now we're going to be filling in some of these triangles here. So what we're also going to really learn today, especially if you're a beginner, is it's difficult to estimate how much paint you're going to need for something. And so just be mindful of looking at how much paint you've prepared, see how far that paint goes, and then that will help you next time to understand how much or how little paint you need to prepare for a project. I've got, you know, you can see the size of the puddle of paint that I've got here. I will probably use all of that. But don't worry if you've not got that much for now. You could always mix more up if you need it. I'm just going to if anyone gets too hot, let me know. I'll open some windows. It's quite warm. One of my sections of my colour wheel. So if you've got a pen or a pencil, you might want to make a few notes just to aid your memory. We've got 6 sections on this colour wheel. This is the most basic colour wheel that that we can do. We're going to have 3 primaries and 3 secondary colours on there. So I'm going to put a little marker as to where I'm going to put my 3 primary colours. It doesn't matter where you put yours, as long as they are equally spaced from each other. So I'm going to put red here. I'm going to put blue here. And I'm going to put yellow here. So they are equally spaced around with a gap in between them. But it doesn't matter what order. So I could have gone yellow, red, blue. I could have gone blue, yellow, red. Doesn't matter. As long as there's a gap in between each one, and they are in these 1, 2, 3 sections here. Now I've written it down just so I don't make a mistake whilst I'm painting and talking at the same time and end up painting the wrong colour in the wrong section, because it does happen. So I'm going to do, let's have a look. I'll do blue first of all. So the reason I've mixed my blue to a single cream consistency is because that is going to be a really nicely, highly concentrated colour. You saw when I did that little sample there, just how lovely and strong that blue is. And it's really important when we start any sort of project or anything like that, that we have a nice stock of strong colour here that we can dip from, because then we can do all sorts of things with that, and we can just take it from the pool that we've got there, and we can water it down if we need to later, but we've got the real stuff there, that we can work from. So I'm going to pick up with my brush. My brush has just been made slightly damp first, so I've dipped it in my water and then wiped off as much excess as I possibly could, because I don't want to water this paint down by going into it with a really full wet brush. I've got what they call a thirsty brush, which means it's slightly damp. It's not dry, it's slightly damp, but it's certainly not wet. It's a thirsty brush. And I'm just going to pick up a little bit of that blue, and I'm looking at my blue triangle here, and I'm going to start to paint. Now you might just want to watch what I do just before you dive in. So I'm going to start to paint from the centre like this. So you can see that that blue is quite nice and strong. I know the colour looks a little bit dark on the screen. Unfortunately, it changes the colours a little bit sometimes. But I'm going to start to come down here until I get to about a third of the way. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to wash my brush, wipe off the excess, and then I'm coming back over to here. So I've got a slightly wet brush with no paint on it, and I'm going to start to drag some of that paint that's there and pull it down. So what that's doing is it's diluting that paint. And what we're creating is what we call a gradient wash. So I'm diluting that paint slightly as it's coming down, like this. I'm going to go, wash my brush, wipe off any excess, come back and do the same. So drag more down like this. So I'm starting off with a really rich mixture of the colour, but then what I'm doing is I'm gradually washing my brush, taking off any paint or any water that's on there, and using that damp brush to then pull that colour right down to the end to create a gradient. Now, if this is the first time you've done anything like this, you might get some little steps in there or lines where you can see the colour not fading quite as gradually as you would like it to, but that's okay. It takes practice, and that's why we're practicing it today. So if you want to have a go at your first one, you can do blue like me, or you can do red or yellow. It's absolutely fine. The important thing is that we start with a nice good amount of really strongly pigmented colour from our palette. Okay, so if you want to make a start on your first one, I'll come around and see how everyone's getting on. If you finish the first one and you're happy with how it's gone, and you think, yeah, this is great, I get this, Emma, this is fine, then you carry on and do your red and your yellow. Okay. Not very, because you don't want to add too much water to it, because then that's when you get your cauliflowering. So you want to wash your brush, you want to wipe off as much excess as you can so it's just damp, and then start pulling that paint down. So just go down the front, you can tip your dirty water into the dirty water jug, and then there's a clean jug. So with this gradient wash here, you can see that time is of the essence really with this. If we spend too long on each of these stages, we run the risk of it drying. And so it's that, and that's the essence really of watercolour. And that's why a lot of people are scared of it, or struggle with it, or just get infuriated with it. Because it's that balancing act of how wet does it need to be, how strong does it need to be, and how fast do I need to work. So with this one, you do need to work quite swiftly, I would say, because you don't want that paint to settle and dry, because if it does, there's no way that you're going to be able to drag that paint down. You know? But it just comes with practice. Also, just watch the good for this because it holds a lot of paint for that initial bit at the top. You can get a nice big amount of strong colour quickly, and then it allows you to sort of fade that out basically.
I've got a problem. I put it in the wrong. That's supposed to be.
Right. Don't worry.
Is there a sample somewhere to do somewhere?
Pour any dirty into this one,
Oh,
and then there's some clean in that one to replenish. So I'll do the red now. So if anyone does need a little reminder of the process, you can watch me do the red. What's nice about doing it this way as well is that you can jump straight onto the next one and you don't have to wait for the first one to dry because we're not going to be touching it or painting anywhere near it. So I'm going to do the red one here. So I've turned my paper round, you'll notice, because it's just easier it's an easier painting position, you know, for me, and it might be for you. You know, don't feel like you've got to contort your arm and your wrist and your hand into all of these strange angles. Turn your paper around to make it easier for you. So I am going to have a very slightly damp brush, so it's hardly any water in it at all, and I'm going to pick up some of this really nice thick single cream consistency red, and I'm going to start from the point at the top and I'm going to come down about 1/3 of the way like that. Then I'm going to wash my brush, wipe off any excess so it's just slightly damp, and I'm going to start to pull at the hem of that red, just pulling it down, and it'll just slightly dilute and it'll just move it down the page there. And then I'm going to wash again. If you're finding that your colour isn't fading very much, if you think, oh, it's staying the same all the way down, then wash your brush more often. Because what's happening is that your brush might be picking up some of that red or that blue. Your brush is picking up the paint and dragging it down, but it's not diluting it. So wash your brush a little bit more often. So do it maybe 2 or 3 times, or maybe 4 times, rather than just 1 or 2 times. If it's fading very fast, then fine, don't wash it quite as often, just keep going. Just keep dragging it down. If it's fading nicely, thinking that's working nicely, that's fading well, it's going to a really pale tint at the edge, that's fine. You don't need to wash it again, just keep going with it. Sometimes it is just about reacting to what the paint is doing for you as well, and everybody's will act differently because everybody's got a different brand of paint, everybody's using a different type of brush. So yours may not work exactly the same as mine or your next door neighbour's. So it's about just how yours is working in front of you. So I'm going to get a nice thick yellow here. Now when you're using a yellow, this is when you really will need clean water, because the yellow will get dirty very easily. And it'll start to look a bit green or maybe a bit orange, depending on what colour your water is. So I'm just coming down here. Now, because yellow is a paler colour as well, you might find that the change in gradient might not be quite as dramatic as it is with the blue or the red, because it's pale anyway to start with. But we'll just try our best just to see what we can do with it. The temptation might be for you to go back and try and paint in the top bit again. I would try and avoid that temptation if you can, because if you have done that, you may have noticed that all that happens is it makes it patchy, or it lifts up the paint that's already there. So you'll notice that I have avoided the temptation to go back up to the top and, in inverted commas, perfect it or improve it. With a gradient wash like this, it's one of these things that it either works or it doesn't. If it hasn't worked, you can't really fix it. That's why it's really good to practice, because then you just get better and better at getting it okay first time. Right, I'm going to leave that to dry now, because we can't really do anything else in any of these gaps yet until these are all dry, because I don't want any wet paint to touch each other, otherwise it's going to bleed. So I'm just going to leave that for a couple of minutes to dry. Right, so now's a good time, if you seem to have used up all of your blue, red and yellow, now's a good time to just replenish those little puddles there in your palette, because we're going to be using them again to mix some secondary colours in a moment. So if you think, oh, I've not got much blue left there, just spend a few minutes just to get yourself a little bit more into your palette there, or change your water if you need to. So I'm just going to get a little bit more blue in there. Might be all right with red. I'll just get a little bit more just in case. So because we're painting onto the photocopy paper, just purely because we're just practicing, it isn't the best paper to paint on. It is going a little bit wrinkly. You can't really use too much water on these, or else it does. It can't hold it. But there's no point us wasting our lovely posh watercolour paper just for doing a little bit of a colour wheel at this point. Let's get a bit more yellow. So I'm just restocking some of my red, yellow and blue in my palette, ready for mixing some secondary colours in a moment. So I'm going to start to mix some secondary colours to put into these gaps now. So where you see two colours either side, we're going to put the mixture of those two colours in the one in the middle. Okay, so we're going to mix yellow and blue, which should come out with a green, into this section just here. In this one, we're going to mix some yellow and red, and in this one, we're going to mix some red and some blue. Now, how you mix them is important, because first of all, like I was saying before, we want to try and introduce as little water as possible to our paints at this stage. And also the ratios that you mix them are important, because some colours are more powerful than others. So it's not as simple as just a 50-50 mix. You know, if I put a 50-50 mix of blue and yellow together, it's going to end up blue. It's not going to be green, because yellow isn't very powerful. You need more yellow than you do blue to create a green, really, with these colours. So that's sort of what we're practicing today. So I always start with the weaker of the two colours first. So I always start with the yellow. So I've got a very thirsty brush here, so hardly any water on that brush at all. And I'm going to take some of that yellow just to one side where I've got an empty space here, like that. And then I'm going to take the tiniest little dot of blue, tiny dot of blue, and mix that in with that yellow. And that will make a green for me there. Okay, so you can see that I used a brush full of yellow, but a tiny dot of blue to make that green. Now I've not really got enough there, so what I'm just going to do is I'm going to scoop up a whole load more of that yellow, because I want enough to paint this triangle, and a tiny little bit more blue. And you can alter the shade to your personal preference. If you want it to be a nice deep green, add a little bit more blue. If you're happy with a paler green, just keep it as a small amount of blue. You'll notice that the shade will change the more blue that you add. It is possible to add too much blue at this stage and it just goes blue, in which case you'll just need to wash your brush and start again. But I've got a nice amount of green there. So in this section, I'm going to start with some green. I've made sure that the two colours either side are dry, so there's no chance of bleeding. And I'm going to start with some green here, like that. And then I'm just going to do exactly the same as I did before, which is wash my brush, wipe off any excess, and then drag that green down as well as I can. It's drying quite quickly, this one actually. As well as I can down to the edge. Like that. Okay. So you always start with the weaker of the paler, the weaker colours of the two colours. You always start with that one first, and you get a nice good brush full of that colour, and then you add a tiny dot of the stronger one. Out of these three colours, I would say the order of strength is blue is the strongest, red is sort of in the middle, and yellow is the weakest. So when I'm doing my orange, when I turn it around here, I'll start with the yellow and I'll add a tiny bit of red into it until I get an orange shade. When I'm doing the purpley colour, I'll start with the red, nice big brush full of red, and add a tiny bit of blue until I get a nice shade that I'm happy with. Okay, you won't get a vibrant purple because to get a really, really vibrant purple, we need to use specific reds and specific blues, which is too in-depth for us to get into today. But you will get sort of probably either like a maroony colour or a burgundy purpley colour today. It'll be interesting to see actually all the different purples that people create. It always ends up that everybody's is slightly different, which is always interesting. So I will leave you to get on with mixing your secondary colours. The key thing to be aware of when you're mixing your colours is just always try and be aware of how much water is on your brush. When you're mixing your colours, when you're mixing the colours together, you want as little water on your brush as possible, because you don't want to be watering that main mix in your palette down. You want to be keeping that really nice and strong. So the key to that is as little water as possible. It's only when we start to paint and when we want to start to intentionally, on purpose, water that paint down, that's when we start to introduce a little bit more water on our brush. Now, if you've done all 6 of your sections, you could be now getting ahead of yourself and getting yourself a piece of your watercolour paper or a page from your pad and dividing it up into 8 boxes like this one here. There we go, you can see it a little bit better now. If you divide it up into 8 boxes with a pencil, if you've not got a pencil with you today, I've got some in the basket on the front table. And you can put a little heading in each of the boxes, and those headings are on this sheet here in the yellow box. So you can see it starts with gradient wash and goes down to stippling. Okay, so I've just got each of those headings in each of those boxes there. So with the gradient wash, what we need to remember is just like before, we want to start with a nice thick, I'm going to use this violet because I love it, a nice thick puddle of this paint. It's almost like if you're into sourdough, it's like your starter. This is going to be your starter here. So I've got a nice thick puddle of this. I'm just running my brush through it, and even though it looks dark, it still feels quite watery to me. The fact I can tell because it's sort of bubbling on the surface, it's still a bit watery. So I'm just going to go back in there and just get a little bit more paint. And you get a feel for it. After a little while, you'll get a feel for noticing, right, okay, that's sticking to the palette a bit more. So I'm confident that that paint is a little bit thicker. And you'll notice as soon as you get it on the page anyway. So I'm going to pop some of that nice strong violet onto there. And then just like before, I'm going to wash my brush, wipe off the excess, and start to drag some of that across like this. Wash my brush, wipe off the excess, drag a little bit more across. So this is a bit more free form in that you're not having to paint inside a triangle this time. You can just do a nice bar of colour, and you can do a couple of different ones if you want to. You know, you can really sort of have a go at practicing that variegated wash. It is one of these ones that just takes practice. You might not get it straight away. It's about making sure you have a nice big amount of this colour to start with. You're washing your brush and making sure that you've not got too much water on that brush when you come back. It's just damp. And then you're just tickling the edge of that paint, the hem of it, to then drag it across. And just notice what the paint is doing. If it's fading nice and quickly, you don't need to go and keep washing your brush quite so often. You might just need to pick up maybe a little bit more water as you go, because your brush might just dry out. But if your paint isn't diluting, if it's staying strong as you're going across, then that is a signal that, right, I've got lots of paint on my brush here. I need to be washing that, wiping off the excess so that I can start to drag what's there rather than keep adding more paint onto the paper from my brush, if that makes sense. For the variegated wash, this is quite a nice one because this is where we can start to introduce two colours to each other. So I'm going to start on a variegated wash with, I'll probably start with the purple again because I like it so much. I'm going to start with the purple over here. I'm going to wash my brush, wipe off the excess and drag that over like this, over to the edge. But then what I'm going to do is choose another colour. So I might use this red that I've already got mixed in there. Nice, strong red. And I'm going to do the exact same thing, but from the opposite direction. So I'm going to start from here with the red. I'm going to start to bring that over, wash my brush, wipe off the excess, and drag that over. And what will happen is the red will start to bleed into and mix in with the purple to start to give me more of a, like I say, variegated. So you've got the two colours that are starting to blend with each other. So I'm basically doing just like a gradient, but then doing the exact same thing but in the opposite direction and allowing those paints, whilst they're both still wet, to overlap and mingle and mix with each other. And you'll get some unexpected results. Don't expect it to be a smooth blend. It may become a little bit patchy. You may get a little bit of separation in the colours, which could be quite interesting. And think about the possibilities of that. You know, if we use that technique for a sky, for example, and we were using a couple of different types of blues, imagine how you could use that to create quite an interesting texture and mood in the sky. So if I hold this up to the camera a little bit more closely, you can sort of see there how my colours have blended with quite unexpected results over here. I've got a little bit of sort of what we call cauliflowering, which is where you get a stronger colour around the edge of the puddle where the paint was. We'll talk a little bit more about cauliflowering and how that happens and why it happens in future classes. It's to do with the differences in ratios of water to paint that are too boring and complicated to get into right now. But Yeah, so this is why it's nice having these large squares, because you can have a go with maybe some different colours. You can see what colours blend nicely into each other and which ones really don't, which ones make horrible sludgy colours in the middle when you mix them together, others make beautiful tones. So what you'll often find is colours that are close to each other on the colour wheel, they blend together much more pleasingly, you know, aesthetically, than colours that are far away from each other. So colours that are close to each other on the colour wheel, we call them analogous or analogous. Some people pronounce it differently. And that means that they blend together really nicely. So like reds into yellows blend beautifully. Blues into greens blend really nicely. But if you were to try and blend an orange into blue, you would end up with a sort of a weird browny grey, maybe like a khaki colour in the middle. So that's an interesting one to experiment with. I'm just going to do a red into yellow here so we can test that theory. So here's my yellow. And I'm going to bring that across whilst that red's still wet. Wash my brush, wipe it off, drag that over a little bit, and that's just going to blend quite nicely. Because we're using the watercolour paper, which is textured, we're getting a little bit of the texture showing through, which is really nice. I'm quite pleased with how that's blending, actually. Quite interesting. Right. So the next one is salt. So salt, as you probably know, absorbs moisture. So it's a really interesting one to use with watercolour. It works better with some colours than others, and it works better with a nice wet wash of colour, because the salt is thirsty. It wants to soak up the water and the paint that is with it. And so if your paint is dry, salt won't work because there's no moisture there for it to absorb. So I'm going to perhaps use this blue, because this blue is quite a strong colour. I'm hoping that I'll get a nice strong effect. So I'm using quite a wet wash of this blue here. You can see I'm adding a little bit of water to it, so it's not the single cream consistency anymore. It's getting a little bit looser and a little bit more puddle-like, a little bit more like tea. And I'm just going to do a really nice big wash of it there, and I might even just add a little bit of extra water from my jar onto it as well, just so it's really nice and wet. And then I'm going to take some of that salt and just sprinkle it over. And what will happen is, if your paint is wet enough, you'll be able to see it starting to work straight away. The salt is sucking up all of the moisture around it, but because that moisture is also containing pigment and colour, it's drawing the colour towards it as well. And so if I just bring this up to the camera a little bit, you can see how it's creating quite an interesting texture there. The type of salt you use, you get a slightly different effect as well. If you were to use table salt, it works just as well, but you get like a finer texture. Obviously I've given you sea salt today, so you know, the sizes of the grains just react slightly differently. But what you do now need to do is leave that to dry. Once it's dry, you can brush the grains of salt off, and it will still leave the texture behind. But it's great for things like if you're doing seascapes and you want the water to look a bit foamy. It's great for rocky textures. You can use it for foliage as well if you're doing landscapes. Anything that you want to give that nice sort of grainy texture to. It's really lovely. What it also does with some colours is it encourages granulation. Now, granulation is where sometimes a colour, as it's drying, will separate into its component colours. So if you've made like a purple and you paint with it and you put some salt on it, it sometimes pulls the colours apart. So you'll get some blues and some reds starting to separate from each other in there as well. And that's really interesting to experiment with. I mean, you know, I could sit with my sketchbook experimenting with different colours and salt and things all day long, but that's just me. So yeah, the cling film we will do another time. What I will do is I'll just show you the wax here. So wax is a resist technique. We use lots of different resist techniques in watercolour. We can use masking fluid, which I can see a few of you have got with you today. But wax, because it repels or resists moisture, you can draw with it, you can rub it on the paper, you can stipple with it, so you can do all sorts of different things with it. Sometimes it's difficult to see where you've drawn, but if you hold it up to the light, sometimes it's possible. And then if you go over that now with a lovely wet wash, so I'm going to use this blue again because I've got a nice big amount of it and it's nice and wet. In fact, I'm going to make it even wetter. So this is where the difference is. When we were doing our gradient, we wanted the paint to be really thick with not much moisture in it, didn't we? Because we wanted that lovely thick, strong colour. For this, we want it wet because we want the wax to really come into its own and resist and repel that water. So I've got it nice and wet. And if I just do a few strokes over this now, it's a bit like when we used to use the invisible ink when we were younger. You can paint over it and it resists. So you can see there, I didn't have enough paint on my brush and it just went scratchy and it didn't work. So I've just gone back in, got a little bit more paint and washing that over like that. Just a few strokes over is normally all you need. If you try and go back over it too many times, so if I go, oh, I'll do a bit more, do a bit more, do a bit more, what will happen is that you might eventually end up covering that wax. The wax eventually gives in and goes, oh, all right then, yes, I'll have some paint on me, it's fine. But just that one or two single passes over there works best with the wax. So down here, you can see we've got this lovely texture of the paper coming through because I just did like a rubbing with the edge of the wax. So, I mean, you could imagine the possibilities for that, for creating, you know, fabric textures and things like that. We use wax when we're wanting to create highlights on something before we start painting. We did a really lovely piece last term where we were doing mountains, like a mountain range, and we used the wax to highlight some of the peaks and some of the textures on the sides of the mountains. So yeah, have a little experiment with the salt and the wax. Oh, look how that salt has changed as it's been drying. It's really sort of, they look like little flowers. That's really interesting. So yeah, have a little go with the salt and the wax. Right, dry brush. So you may detect from the name of this technique what this involves. So what I've mixed up here are some thick paint. So similar to when I used the gradient, did the gradient wash, my cream, single cream consistency paint. I've mixed some up ready in my palette. I'm just going to add a little bit more. So you can see there it's quite thick, it's dark, it's luscious. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to clean and dry the brush. So I'm actually going to wipe it on the tissue so that there's no water in that brush at all. And now, if I was to dip the tip of the brush into that paint, I'm not picking up too much, I'm just dipping the tip in because I don't want to soak up too much paint into this brush because then it won't be dry anymore. It'll be wet because it'll be full of paint. So just dipping the tip there like that. And then if I just start to do some strokes coming upwards like this, you can see you're getting a very different look to your strokes. They will be scratchy, they will be textured, they'll be feathery, they'll go thin and disappear at the end like this. And you can see straight away how this could be used for things like grasses and reeds and stems, and if you're doing landscapes or even seascapes, or it works great for fur if you're painting an animal. It just makes it feel that little bit coarser. You're not getting these lovely, smooth, soft, billowy strokes with your brush. They're just that little bit more textured. So I can just keep dipping in a little bit on the tip of the brush. It's a dry brush. If you're losing that roughness, if it just looks a bit too wet and a bit too smooth, just dry your brush and try again. Because it may be that your brush has maybe soaked up a bit too much paint, and I'll show you what I mean by that. So if I've got a lot of paint on there and then I try to do this, look at that, it's slightly different. I'm getting it's a lovely stroke, but it's not a dry brush stroke. So I'm just going to dry that off, just to get a little bit of paint on the tip, and like that. Now you can layer that up as well, you can build that up. So if I show you my one on here, can you see how I built this up with blues, with greens, and I really started to create some depth in that. So you can imagine if you were painting like a riverside scene or something like that, if I just pick up a tiny bit of blue, and I can just start to do some strokes with that as well. So for the dry brush, we want the paint to be quite a strong consistency. We want it to have as little water in it as possible. You could even, and I do this sometimes if I'm just wanting to do a quick little study, I'll just have a slightly damp brush and I will just pick it up straight off my block there. I'll just pick it up straight off the block. I've not wet it or worked it in. I'm just picking up a little bit there and then a little bit of dry brush on there like that. So, I mean, it's possible to do it like that as well. Just a little bit off there. And then, oh yeah, getting that nice, juicy, scratchy line. So have a little go with that. I'm breaking some colour blending rules and I'm putting a bit of red over the top of it, but why not? We're here to experiment. The great thing about dry brush as well is it dries really quickly. So, you know, within a couple of minutes, especially in a warm room like this, that is dry. So I can build up more colour onto the top of it without risking smudging it. So you can really build up those layers and that depth quite quickly, because there's less water in the paint, so it dries quicker. So I'm going to prepare a couple of colours that I know are going to blend together nicely. So maybe refer back to your colour wheel and pick a couple of colours that are close to each other on the colour wheel, maybe yellow and red or blue and green or something like that. So I've already got some blue, so I'm just going to prepare myself some green and have that there like that. Okay, so I'm just going to make quite a wet version of that green. You can see here that I'm watering it down a little bit. So this is more like a tea consistency rather than your single cream. You can see that it's bubbling on the surface there. And I'm going to come over to here and I'm going to just paint a little bit in there. Now this can be as wet as you like here. Probably not like a puddle, but you can see that it's quite nice and wet on the surface. Now if I take my brush, just clean off the green, wipe off the excess, and now I'm just going to zoom out a bit so you can see it a little bit easier. There we go. Now I'm just going to pick up a little bit of this blue. I'm just going to start dabbing it into the green. You can see that because the green is still wet, the blue is just spreading into it really nicely. The longer we leave the green, the drier it starts to get, and so then the blue won't spread quite as much. It'll stay it won't soften around the edges. It'll stay quite precise and detailed. So whilst the green is still wet, I can dab in some blue, and it starts to blend in and make some quite interesting textures. Now this is starting to granulate a little bit. I don't know if you can see there, the green is starting to separate just very slightly. The blue is starting to settle and spread in some areas. It's starting to gather a bit more up here, and I think that's just because my paper is just slightly curling, and so the water is just sort of collecting more towards the top than the bottom. But I can always tip it a little bit and just get the colours to, oh, look at that. They're just starting to move around, and you can edge them around and really just start to get some quite interesting things going on there. So wet in wet is literally what it says on the tin. You're putting wet paint into wet paint. So it's nice to have a little experiment with those. I might just, whilst that green's still wet, I'm just going to push my luck a bit, and I'm going to see if I can put perhaps a little bit of orange or yellow into that and just see. That's like quite a deep orange that I've put in. It may spread, it may not. The green may have dried a little bit too much, but I always like to just see what happens. Okay, stippling. This is where we can use a different part of our brush. So up until now, we've been using the tip, haven't we, for when we were doing our dry brush. We've been using the main belly of the brush to give us nice wet areas like this. This is where we can start to really play around with what different marks can we make by putting the brush in different directions, maybe just using the tip of it in some areas or the side of it in other areas, maybe changing the angle of our brush. So if you were doing something like a field of wildflowers or something like that, you could imagine how just using this stippling effect just to, some tiny dots in some areas and then some bigger ones in other areas, this can create texture and loose detail. So maybe, we could turn this, if I put a plant pot underneath this, we could turn this into a lovely little pot of flowers in the garden. If I had some blues in there and some greens in there, maybe a few little pops of pink. You can see how stippling creates this quite interesting little texture. You can stipple other colours into it as well. Just be aware that if you touch colours that are already wet, those colours might blend into each other, but, why not try it? You might come up with something really interesting. So, yeah, stippling is using the tip and the edge and the side of the brush, rather than a stroke, just more of a touch and a dab, almost like you're stamping, making little stamps across your page like that. So have a little try of the wet in wet and the stippling. When you feel like, I've had a go with those, I'm happy with those, you could use the last 25 minutes, wow, 20 to 25 minutes to have a go at some little feather shapes. Now, what I've given you on here is obviously a few little ideas to get you started, so you can see, hopefully you can look at this and you can sort of think, all right, I can see how they may have achieved that. I can see that that's a little bit of wet in wet. I can see that maybe they've used a bit of resist to create these white spots. So you could perhaps use your wax to put some spots in first before you paint on top. You can see where some of the colours have blended into each other. So you can try some wet in wet techniques there. You can see where some colours are stronger and then go weaker. So maybe that's a bit more of a gradient wash that they've done on that one there. You can see on some parts of the feathers, you can see very thin, specific little lines. So maybe a little bit of dry brush could be used in some areas to create those very specific details. I've put these outlines here at the bottom because if you like to sketch things out first before you paint them, you could sketch a little bit of a shape, something like this, before you paint them in. But I know not everybody feels the need to sketch first. You might just want to dive straight in and do the painting. You may want to maybe paint the, I always call it the spine, but the central line up the feather, and then paint the details coming out from the centre. It's completely up to you how you do it. This is your chance just to play really with some of the lovely colours that you found in your palette and the techniques that we've used here to just come up with a few little doodles just for the last 20 minutes or so. And I'll come round and see how everyone's doing.